From a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret. Teaching Paradox, Crusader Kings III, Part 2a. Rascally Vassals. This is the second part of a four-part series examining the historical assumptions of the popular historical grand strategy game Crusader Kings III by Paradox Interactive. Last time, we opened by discussing how CK3 attempts to simulate and represent the distinctly personal character of rule and decision-making in the Middle Ages, and how this contrasted with both Paradox's other grand strategy titles, which are far more state-oriented. This week we're going to turn from the person of the ruler to the structure of polity that CK3 envisages. Fundamentally, Crusader Kings III is a game about political fragmentation and decentralization, in a way that few other strategy games are. As we noted last week, most of Paradox's titles adopt a broadly neo-realist framework when thinking about international relations, which tends, in most common forms, to treat states as largely unitary, a single entity with a single set of interests. But there are no states as such in CK3. The polities that do exist are highly fragmented, with power shared between a liege and many vassals who essentially function as states within a state, who may contribute revenue and levies to their liege, but may also oppose them and actively work against the liege's goals and strategies. This post ended up being very long, so I have split it into two parts. This week's part will look at how the game models feudal vassalage in Christian Europe, while next week's second half will look at how the game modifies those systems to try and model different forms of political fragmentation in Islamic polities, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. But first, if you want to contribute levies to this project, please share what you are reading. If you have a really high opinion modifier of these posts, you can also contribute revenues via Patreon. And if you want updates whenever a new post appears, you can click below for email updates or follow me on Twitter at Bret, where I hold court. One more thing to note before we dive in. The same as last week, there is going to be a lot of, when we get to it, notes as we go through here. CK3's core mechanics, characters, vassal-liege relationships, opinion bonuses, religion, and culture are all fairly tightly intertwined because they all impact characters' opinions of other characters. So, teasing them apart for the purpose of analysis is at best a bit imperfect. The next post in the series will be dealing with norms, both cultural and religious, along with the broader concept of legitimacy. So all of those issues will be returned to in more detail then. Image. Map from Crusader Kings III of the Iberian Peninsula from Bret's game under House Al-Yaliki. Image description. And of course, we pick up with our running CK3 game, steering House Al-Yaliki. With the death of Ajanas I, we move on to Ajanas II ibn Ajanas, his son, an excellent administrator, decent diplomat, and indifferent warrior. That's not a problem though, because, as you can see here, I am already the preeminent power in the Iberian Peninsula. The issue now is shaping events to allow me to fire the detente struggle ending, which is going to take some doing. It requires having an alliance with every independent Iberian ruler. At the moment, there are far too many. And holding directly less than half of the peninsula. At the moment, I hold a bit too much. So, I need to compress the number of independent rulers and shrink my kingdom slightly. Ironically, partible inheritance is actually going to be useful here. End of image description. Fragmenting Charlemagne. We should start by clarifying some terms. In its current form, CK3 distinguishes between three government types: feudal government, mostly the Christian polities of Europe as well as the polities of South Asia; clan governments, mostly but not entirely Islamic polities; and tribal governments, mostly steppe and Baltic peoples with decidedly non-state polities, and also some but not all of the West African polities. Note 1. West Africa is not my area of expertise, but what I do know about the polities there would make me hesitant to designate many of them as tribal, though the game largely reserves the feudal government type there for the most centralized West African states, like the Ghana Empire. One hopes a more detailed system with bespoke West African mechanics is on the CK3 DLC to-do list. End of note 1. Veteran readers of the blog will already know that I generally avoid the terms feudal and feudalism, as do many medievalists these days. The problem is that feudalism comes to conflate two very different systems: manorialism, the economic system, which structured the relations between peasant farmers, mostly serfs, and their elite landlords; and vassalage, the political system, which structured relations between elites. But these systems and the relationships they structured were very different, and their conflation together as a single system is a modern, not medieval, construction. Consequently, I will talk about vassalage and manorialism as two distinct systems, which often, but not always, coexisted, rather than a single system called feudalism. This post is almost entirely on the vassalage half of this formation. We'll discuss the game's treatment of manorialism in the final part of the series. And, indeed, the in-game definition of feudalism engages in that conflation, declaring that, quote, "The feudal system is based on the relationship between the landholder and those who provide services and labor in order to live there," end quote, which treats together the provision of farm service and military service, which we ought probably to think about separately. Nevertheless, it is hard to fault a game made for the public for using a term that is almost exclusively the one used by the general public, and still in use by some scholars. And the definition being used here doesn't come out of nowhere. Rather, it is the definition of feudalism, which includes both vassalage and manorialism, advanced by Marc Bloch in La Société Féodale, 1939, known in English as Feudal Society, one of those magisterial foundational classics of scholarship. So, while these aren't the terms I'd use in a class, it makes sense to use them in the context of a game, and they are well rooted in scholarship, albeit also well contested in the more recent scholarship. Image. Definition of the feudal government form in Crusader Kings III. The great challenge of any game set in the European Middle Ages, or a fantasy variant thereof, is to represent a political system whereby state capacity was very limited, and as a result, political power was extremely fragmented. While this system, vassalage in particular, is often associated in public thinking broadly with the whole of the Middle Ages in Europe, it only really emerged in the 9th century. The Middle Ages are generally taken to have begun in the 5th century, and arrived in different places at different times. Fundamentally, the system of vassalage we see being represented in CK3 was a product of the Carolingian Empire trying to make do with extremely limited administration. Let's back up for a moment. As we've discussed elsewhere, The late Roman Empire, particularly after Diocletian, developed a large, complex, centralized bureaucracy, quite different from the generally fairly light system of Roman governance in the early empire. So, when the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, this system, with its complex bureaucracies and officials appointed from among the landholding magnate class to offices they held at the pleasure of the emperor or king, this was the system that the barbarian successor states inherited. But the vibrant urban culture which produced the literate bureaucrats required to make that system work had largely faded with the empire, leaving the successor states with a bureaucratic top-down model of governance with few bureaucrats to run it. In the immediate aftermath, they turned to the large landholders, many of them the old Roman-era aristocrats, to try to farm out the job of administration. Each kingdom's system was subtly different, but broadly, these kings hoovered up wealth and used it through a gift economy to get their elites to do the job of administering in some minimal way the territories the king notionally controlled. Nevertheless, these posts are still appointed posts, so a big landholder who wants these sorts of jobs needs the king's favor to get them, and the royal gifts that come with faithful service. That is already a system where power is heavily fragmented, but there's a final step necessary which comes with the Carolingians. Usurping the Merovingian kings of the Franks, the Carolingians over 3 generations, Charles Martel, his son Pepin, and then Pepin's sons Carloman, and especially Charles, Charlemagne, assembled a vast empire covering what is today France, Germany, northern Italy, Austria, the Czech Republic, Switzerland, Slovenia, Croatia, and parts of northern Spain. At no point in those vast conquests did they conquer a state which had developed a functional political bureaucracy, while the separation of secular authority, Charlemagne, and religious authority, the Pope, meant that the well-developed religious bureaucracy was not generally available for large-scale administration. Image. Map of the expansion of the Carolingian Empire over time. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a map of the expansion of the Carolingian Empire over time. End of image description. In order to administer those conquests, flung widely enough that even the itinerant court could not visit them all, the Carolingians developed, and I am greatly simplifying this system, a system of royal officials drawn from the landed aristocracy and occasionally the church. The empire was divided into military administrative districts, each of which got a leader called a comes, pronounced comes, a Latin word meaning companion, in the sense of a military retainer of a king, like the late Roman army, which moved with the emperor, the comitatenses, which in French was comte, which gives us our word, count and county. Note 2. Remember when I said the base political unit of Crusader Kings III was counts? End of note 2. These comes were appointed officials who were responsible for overseeing tax collection, recruitment, and justice in their districts, as well as being local military commanders in a pinch. Notionally, they were then overseen by roving officials called the missi dominici, rulers' envoys, to ensure they were doing their job well and effectively, which, at least in principle, serves as an extension of the appointment system the Merovingians had been using prior. After Charlemagne, however, the strength of central Carolingian rule begins to wane. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, was frequently at war with his own ambitious sons. Note 3. The issue being that the birth of his fourth son, Charles, to be Charles the Bald, and Louis's efforts to provide an inheritance for Charles upset the other three sons, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis, leading to conflict. End of note 3. Who, after his death, warred with each other. At a deeper level, Charlemagne's administrative system was probably unworkable from the beginning. The division of authority between the comes and the missi was never clear, and the steady shift in military emphasis from an infantry-focused army of militia farmers to an army focused on aristocratic cavalry shifted power towards the aristocrats and away from central government. Image. Map of the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. Image description. Via Wikipedia, the initial fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire split between the sons of Louis the Pious. The Central Kingdom would fragment further after the death of Lothair I in 855, split between Italy in the south, Lotharingia in the north, and Burgundy in the middle, with each chunk going to a different son. End of image description. In either case, what we see in the 9th century is that the comites are increasingly able to secure their positions to their sons, leading to the positions to become hereditary, with the temporary administration of lands becoming a hereditary right, or even ownership of those lands. Of course, once those nobles, and we can start calling them that at this point, no longer need to rely on royal appointment to legitimate their control over this chunk of the kingdom, the king's position relative to his nobles, now properly his vassals, grew weaker. At the same time, especially in the context of military strains both internal, civil war, and external, Vikings, on the Carolingian Empire, this system, while it had negative long-term consequences for royal power, was very effective at raising the kind of military power that was needed in the moment, which was increasingly elites on horses. Though, a clear socially defined knighthood is still many years away from forming. That system in turn spread out unevenly from wreckage of the Carolingian Empire, which split into three after the death of Louis the Pious. In Germany, the eastern chunk of the Carolingian Empire, East Francia, eventually became the Holy Roman Empire, and so spread those institutions even as the Carolingian line there failed in the early 10th century, replaced by a series of dynasties with a mix of hereditary and elective traditions. Across the Channel, meanwhile, the English kingdom at this time was actually quite differently organized and more effectively centralized. Feudalism only really arrives in England with William the Conqueror of Normandy, who, after seizing the English throne in 1066, imposed a more French-style system of governance. Note 4. Once again, we are sliding over a lot of complexity here. End of note 4. And of course, that same sort of system would arrive in the Levant through the creation of the Crusader states in the 1090s. Image. Map of Bret's Iberian expansions from Crusader Kings III. Image description. I begin expanding fairly aggressively here in order to compress the number of rulers, but also to grab enough holdings in Northwest Africa to be able to fairly carefully shape the succession. I want to regulate the number of pieces and the size which I am breaking Kinkir into. Fortunately, I have already switched from Confederate partition, which can create titles on succession, to regular partition, which cannot. So I can control which royal titles are in play for the creation of independent realms. Expansion here ends up being a mix of conquest to remove independent kingdoms and diplomacy, offering protected status to independent lesser nobles of different faiths in order to pull them under my rule, which of course fits with the goal of creating a multi-religious state. End of image description. And It has been noted that CK3 is somewhat fudging the extent of this system at both of its start dates, 867 and 1066, but especially the former. Interesting, at this year's PDXCon, the CK3 team was asked at their Q&A if they would consider earlier start dates, and they responded no, on the grounds that they were already stretching it to push feudalism, their word, so early, noting that many of the recommended starting lords in the 867 start were, in fact, the first nobles to make their positions hereditary rather than appointed. We'll come back to this later, but part of the struggle here is that CK3 doesn't have good systems for centralized governments, or for having centralized governments deconsolidate, which makes the fudge of having feudalism in England a bit earlier than it should, and the refusal to push an earlier start date than 867 make a lot of sense, even if the developers are fairly open that these are necessary fudges for gameplay, much the way European states are a lot more unitary in the first decades of EU4 than they ought to be. Vassalage as a game system. The consequence of this progressive fragmentation as the rule of comites, by now we can really call them counts, and other similar nobles, became hereditary was that the power of kings was diminished. Kings increasingly only exerted direct rule over their personal lands, attempting to interfere in a vassal's administration of their lands, which was, you will recall, the point of Charlemagne's mise, could be seen as an infringement on the traditional rights of those vassals. And the royal lands could be very small indeed, because kings were expected to dole out lands as gifts for military service, and also because partible inheritance repeatedly fragmented the royal domains, especially in France. Image. Map of political fragmentation in the Kingdom of France. Image description. A wonderful map of political fragmentation in the Kingdom of France made by Gabe Moss. Note just how tiny the actual royal domains have become here by 987. Fortunately for House Capet, the Capetians will have almost absurd luck over the next several hundred years, termed the Miracale Capetien, the Capetian miracle, with having one, and often only one, heir in successive generations, avoiding succession disputes and successfully making the monarchy hereditary within the family while also consolidating progressively more royal land and power. End of image description. In theory, the king still held all of the land and was merely granting it out to his vassals, thus becoming the vassal's liege, in exchange for their military and political support. But in practice, the various counts, and by now dukes, from the Latin dux, leader, and other nobles, controlled their territories directly, with the king as first among equals expected to resolve disputes between vassals and to direct the kingdom's military affairs beyond its borders. The land the vassal holds is a fief, the process of it being granted, or its grant being recognized when it was inherited, is called enfiefment, all of which are generally thought to derive from the Latin foedum, meaning a treaty or solemn agreement. The vassal receiving a title either in fact, because it is the initial grant of land, or symbolically, because he has already inherited the land and the king is merely recognizing this, did so with a ritual oath of either homage or fealty. With homage being the notionally stronger form, one could swear fealty to multiple lieges, but homage, in theory, only to one. Now, as you can see from the map above, many of the vassals of the King of France themselves controlled vast territories, the vastness of which replicated the exact same problem that the Carolingians had confronted. How do you administer a large territory when your society lacks the bureaucratic apparatus to do so directly? And so they replicated the system downward, with higher nobles, like dukes and counts, offering fiefs to lower nobles, barons, earls, and castellans. There's a wide array of titles for these lower nobles, under the same terms. Take this land in exchange for owing me military support, which you will raise and supply from the revenues the land and its peasants generate for you. It should be noted that the peasantry is not part of this system. A peasant is not a vassal. That's why we generally separate vassalage as a system from manorialism. The rules are different. That said, there could be non-noble vassals, most often towns that were either under the governance of a bishop, a survival or replication of Roman-era church administration, or were self-governing. Image. Map of the Iberian Peninsula from Bret's playthrough of Crusader Kings III following his initial conquests. Image description. And here we are. I've created or usurped 3 additional kingdom-level titles, which will, on the death of Adonis II, fragment off into much smaller realms, because they are much smaller de jure kingdoms, helmed by my primary heir's brothers and 1 nephew, which will make it relatively easy for him to form alliances with them, while the lost territory will drop him below 50% of the total land area of Iberia. The final tricky task here was getting into the right struggle phase, because everyone needs to be in a conciliatory mood for this to work, too. This whole process is a lot more complicated than had I simply aimed to end the struggle by raw conquest. But that's part of the fun. End of image description. So, how does CKIII simulate this complex system? Regardless of government type, tribal, clan, feudal, every polity is composed of an independent lord, often but not always a king or emperor, and their collection of vassals and the vassals of their vassals, and so on. Each noble in the chain raises 2 kinds of resources from their holding, taxes and levies. Each vassal then sends a percentage of those taxes and levies upward 1 level in the chain of their de facto liege, not their de jure liege, if the 2 are different. For feudal vassals, the percentages are fixed by the formal obligations in their contract, inherited from one generation to the next, rather than subject to vassal opinion. Though contributions are reduced if the vassal's de facto liege is not also their de jure liege. It's hard to insist on someone fully carrying out their ancestral obligations to you if they don't technically have any ancestral obligations. I've mentioned this before, but to reiterate, the tiers of titles are Baron of a single holding, Count, Duke, King, and Emperor, in order of lowest to highest. A ruler is considered to have the status of the tier of their highest title. Vassals must be a lower tier than lieges. No vassal may have more than 1 liege, we'll come back to that, making the system a fairly strict pyramid. Moreover, vassal contracts are unique to them, though inherited by their heirs, and may specify non-standard levy or tax obligations, lock in certain inheritance rules, provide special privileges, and so on, making each liege-vassal relationship effectively unique. There is a necessary bit of ahistorical standardization in this model of clearly delineated titles with clear ranks. In actual historical practice, titles were not nearly so standardized. Indeed, much of the standardization of standard systems of titles happened later, as the titles were increasingly detached from actual direct governance of territory. By way of example, the game titles Matilda of Tuscany as a duchess, which fairly reflects her territory and position in the empire, but not her actual historical title as La Grande Contessa, the Great Countess. But Tuscany was not a county either, nor yet a duchy. Tuscany's status as a Grand Duchy is a later phenomenon of the 16th century. Instead, to the best I can tell, it was regarded as a Margraviate, from the German Markgraf, or March Lord, with March here meaning a border military district in this period. The game works in some recognition of these complexities, with culture-specific variations on titles, so lords with ducal-level titles might go by a wide range of names. Petty King, various feudal, Grand Prince, Russian, High Chieftain, various tribal, Mahasamanta, Indian, Atabeg, Okus Turkic, Emir, various Muslim, Du, Greek, and so on. I think that, combined with the gameplay impacts of religion and culture, next time, serve to alert the player to at least some degree that there's a lot of variety here being compressed for gameplay's sake. A core part of this system, in turn, are factions, which reflect informal coalitions of vassals within a single polity, trying to achieve political objectives. At present, vassals have 4 functions to choose from: independence, aiming to break away from the kingdom; dissolution, aiming to dissolve the kingdom entirely; liberty, aiming to lower crown authority, essentially pushing the rights of vassals over the prerogatives of kings; and claimant, pushing for a different ruler. A faction with enough military power between all of its vassals will make demands and, if refused, rise in revolt to enforce those demands. Keeping vassals out of factions thus becomes crucial to maintaining the coherence of large realms. We'll get into next week some of those strategies. But the upshot here is that even though vassal opinion doesn't modify levies or taxes for feudal lords, its role in the faction system means it cannot be ignored. A liege must keep most of their vassals happy, because vassals only provide a percentage of their military strength to their liege, but will field all of their strength in the event they rebel, typically through forming a faction whose demands are refused. Large realms can be dangerously unstable unless the ruler can maintain a large personal territory, the domain from which they can draw the backbone of their own army independent of their vassals. Doing so under partible inheritance is particularly hard. As you can see, concerns about keeping the royal possessions together dominating a lot of my House Al-Yaliki strategy. Consequently, to maintain stability, rulers have to keep their vassals happy, through mechanics we'll be exploring mostly next week. Meanwhile, vassal holdings are, as noted last week, personal, meaning they may bear relatively little relation to the de jure internal divisions of a kingdom. Double dukes, ducal-level vassals controlling 2 duchies, are particularly common, and such large and powerful vassals become major movers in internal politics because of the tremendous amount of power they can deliver to a faction if they join it. In addition, rulers need to stock a series of administrative and military positions. For king and emperor level rulers, those are the 5 members of their council, 1 each for the game's major attributes, plus a selection of knights, here effectively unit and army commanders, whereas household knights are reflected in men-at-arms regiments, and typically at least a few court positions. Some of those positions can be filled with landless courtiers, but generally, the major vassals expect these jobs, will be angry if they don't get some of them, and in any event, reflect the largest pool of talent for them. Consequently, in addition to handling the extraction of revenues locally, vassals are, also, the largest source of the king's subordinates in the very limited central government. Finally, there is crown authority, which reflects, in an abstract way, the level of centralization a kingdom has. Lower levels of crown authority make vassals happy, and higher levels make them actively unhappy, which will funnel them into the liberty faction to lower crown authority. At the same time, higher crown authority raises substantially the levels and money vassals owe to their liege, improving the king's power at the expense of vassals, and provides more powerful options for shaping who owns what, like title revocation and the ability at maximum crown authority to designate an heir in defiance of inheritance norms. Just about every polity starts with very low crown authority. Over time, rulers are going to try to increase that, while vassals will attempt to keep it low. As a simulation of vassalage-based political organization, the system is broadly effective. Most games, and even much fantasy long-form fiction, continues to imagine medieval polities as unified states, or at most, as divided into only a handful of constituent parts, which are not themselves then subdivided further. CKIII is one of the few games that leans into the complexity of actual political systems, having dozens of direct vassals and hundreds of indirect vassals is not uncommon for large realms. To take one example, Emperor Henry IV, in-game as Kaiser Heinrich IV. I love the culture-specific titles and names in the game, by the by. Begins the game in the 1066 start with 61 direct vassals, including more than a dozen dukes with their own large collections of vassals, as many as 15 direct vassals for some. When it comes to scheming and politics, all of these figures matter, though some matter more than others. Historically minded players beginning at this start will especially note the powerful Duchess of Tuscany, Matilda, and realize the trouble she could cause, as indeed historically she did. Adding to this complexity is that while the king may be a feudal lord, that does not mean all of his vassals are. Indeed, republic-type vassals, reflecting the civic governments of towns, will be a factor in almost every polity, albeit these aren't as extensively developed in-game yet. And theocratic vassals, reflecting territories controlled by bishops or monasteries, will be a factor in most. And it is entirely possible for a feudal polity to end up with some vassals whose government is clan or tribal in nature. That complexity is actually a fairly good representation of the often very complex polities this system created, where each liege-vassal relationship was a unique and bespoke bilateral relationship. Moreover, the system of crown authority provides a framework, if abstract, for two related tensions that defined a lot of the politics in the period. For vassals that are the de jure subjects of their liege, the normal channel of discontent is towards factions to lower crown authority, which the liege is going to keep trying to raise, creating the cycle of tensions between central authority and vassals which defined much of the politics in the period, rather than attempting to simulate every small dispute, which might get properly difficult from both a gameplay and a game development standpoint. The abstraction of crown authority and struggles to decrease it can cover a wide range of such conflicts, like the Barons' Wars in England or the wars related to the investiture controversy, which had as much to do with the powers the king could wield as it did the religious position of bishops. Image: map of duchies and vassals of the Holy Roman Empire. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a map of the constituent duchies and other vassals of the Holy Roman Empire circa 1000 AD, which still show traces of the old Carolingian system, particularly the marches in the east intended as frontier military districts. These notional subunits continued to fragment as subsequent emperors favored a larger number of smaller vassals. End of image description. At the same time as the game advances, for most of these polities, the opportunities for power centralization will grow, leading to a slow, halting march towards progressively more centralized polities. Crown authority levels are gated by innovations, which are gated by years, more on this later, and in general the progression through innovations, realm development, building new holdings or expanding old ones, and so on, will tend, over time, to give rulers more of a margin on the opinion and power of their vassals, which they will naturally consume by raising crown authority. That creates a noticeable ebb and flow, since poor rulers or unlucky succession, especially when the heir is a minor, will create windows for vassals to push crown authority back down, by force if necessary. But over time, more effectively centralized realms will emerge, and because of the levy benefits of those more centralized realms, they will tend to be stronger than their neighbors, and thus expand, although expansion increases the number of vassals as compared to the largely static royal domain, increasing the risk of factions and potentially refracturing the kingdom. Image: map of fragmentation in the Holy Roman Empire by the reign of Frederick Barbarossa. Image description: via Wikipedia, increased fragmentation by the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, reigned 1155 to 1190. Whereas in France, the Capetians would successfully, if very slowly, centralize royal power, in Germany, this process failed. CKIII tends to drive over time towards centralization, so it is relatively rare to see a large state remain so weak and fragmented in the late game, though the systems to produce that result, liberty factions mostly, do exist. Note that only the lands shown there in the bright yellow were directly administered by the king, while territories in purple were ecclesiastical, administered by the clergy, monasteries, holy orders, or other elements of the church. End of image description. We'll come back to this point in the last part of the series, but I think this system works better for some polities than for others. It does a good job of reflecting, for instance, the steady centralization of power within the Kingdom of France under the Capetians. France went from a badly fragmented, highly decentralized kingdom, where the king's powers were extremely limited in the 10th century, to a substantially more centralized and effective kingdom by the 14th century. And that process of very early stage state formation is fairly well reflected in the systems here. But the steady pressure towards state centralization doesn't seem quite as effective in modeling the Holy Roman Empire, which spent much of this period, especially following 1200 or so, making the same journey in the opposite direction, steadily becoming more fragmented and less centralized. The culprit here is the innovation system, which pushed many of the game's systems towards a fairly teleological chronology, where innovations must come to all cultures in a fairly set sequence. Put a pin in that. We'll be back to it in a couple of weeks. Finally, there are some elements where complexity was clearly sacrificed for playability. The most obvious of these is that each vassal can have only one liege. By contrast, actual medieval vassals often had multiple lieges, with different titles owing allegiance to different notional lords. The distinction was thus sometimes made historically between homage, owed to one's primary liege, and fealty, which might be offered to several lords, though the terms and nature of these relationships were not at all standardized. While CK3 opts to stress the personal nature of rule, and thus divides polities into rulers rather than titles, the medievals themselves often thought of these questions in terms of titles rather than rulers. Thus, as the Duke of Normandy, William of Normandy was the vassal of the King of France, but as the King of England, William the Conqueror, same fellow, was an independent ruler. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this is what is sometimes termed the Angevin Empire, the vast territories in France of the Plantagenet kings of England. The contrast between de jure and de facto does provide some simulation of the tensions this creates, since the King of England holding de facto territories which de jure should be under the King of France both creates severe opinion penalties between the two monarchs, and also an excuse for war between them. That's not a terrible representation of the Capetian-Plantagenet conflicts, but also not a perfect one. Nevertheless, as a system for modeling decentralized rule through a system of vassalage as practiced in Western Europe during the High and Late Middle Ages, I think Crusader Kings III does better than effectively any other game I have played. The commitment to developing the system in something approaching its full complexity, albeit with some of the sharp edges sanded down a bit, brings home to the player quite effectively just how decentralized the states were. The first time a player realizes they have a troublesome vassal, perhaps an ambitious double duke, and that they cannot actually get rid of them despite being king or even emperor, is a fantastic learning opportunity for understanding the nature of personal rule in a vassalage-based system. Likewise, players working as vassals will find they resort to many of the same inheritance and marriage strategies, backed up by military force, which assembled things like the Angevin Empire in the first place. Quite accurately for the period, the balance of mortality and male preference succession in much of Christian Europe means that there are bound to be several heiresses or brother-to-brother successions in each generation of aristocrats in any large kingdom, each providing the opportunity for vassals to expand within the empire in a way that, again, their king may be powerless to stop. Image: The Death of Aeneas II, from Bret's playthrough of Crusader Kings III. Image description: Aeneas II dies in 972, and all goes as planned. The kingdom fragments ever so slightly right as we move into the conciliation phase, reflecting a mood of compromise and friendship developing, after a period of more open hostility and struggle. I haven't talked much about the Iberian struggle mechanics so far. I think they're a very interesting game system to try to reflect conflict with waxing and waning intensity. Essentially, the struggle proceeds in a cycle: opportunity to hostility, conciliation to compromise to repeat. Hostility and conciliation are the main end state stages, and actions in the opportunity stage determine which of those two will occur. Encouraging the conciliation phase meant that for all of my fighting, I had to make a lot of generally conciliatory gestures, since those are what promote the conciliation phase. Gifting artifacts, building a wide circle of friends, making alliances across religious lines, and so on. End of image description. On to Part 2b. So, while there is certainly some flattening of complexity in CK3's system for representing fragmented European polities, particularly in how the complexity of different titles and vassals with multiple lieges is condensed into a fairly simple pyramid of obligations, overall, this system is quite good. In its terminology and implementation, it reflects fairly well the older Mark Bloch vision of feudalism as a social system. One thing we haven't covered here yet is how the game translates this into practical actions the player takes in order to maintain relations with their vassals. That's in Part 3. But this system provides a good foundation for it. That said, when it came to modeling the Christian polities of the period, CK3 had a fairly good starting position. CK2's mechanics already did this fairly well. There have certainly been some modifications here in how Crown authority works, the way factions function, and the role of the council, some of which is implementing as core features things which in CK2 were in DLCs. But the CK2 bones set the mechanical foundation here pretty clearly. Next week, we're going to come to the second half of this topic, however, where we look at how well the game handles Muslim polities. CK2's system for this was a bit of a mess, particularly the decadence system, but also innate modifiers like hostility between brothers and bespoke mechanics packed into the ICTA government form, tax changes as well as greater latitude to revoke ducal titles, which made Islamic polities more effectively centralized by nature rather than as a consequence of their structure or development, which in turn tended to mean they didn't fragment to the degree that their historical parallels did. I think it's fair to say that this was one area of significant player dissatisfaction in the design of CK2, in part because of the feeling that these mechanics were gamey and thus ahistorical. So, does CK3 do any better on this score? This has been a recording from a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux, recorded by myself, A Great Divorce, for accessibility and sharing purposes. If you enjoyed this content and wish to engage with it or support Bret, please check the description for links to the original post on his blog, his Twitter, and his Patreon. I highly encourage you to share, support, and engage with his works on any and all platforms if you are so inclined. If you wish to support me, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this or any other content here that you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening.